So, Dr. van Heerden, where does South Africa find herself now after this historic election?
Well, this is a very good question. You know, when the results started coming in at the Results Operation Center of the IEC, and the early prediction from the CSIR predictor model suggested that the ANC was going to get 41%, there was immediately denial. Understandably so. I mean, how is it possible that a governing party can lose more than 17% of its voter support? It is unheard of. 5%, 8%, a disaster would be 10%, which is what most predict. The ANC would lose about 10%, would hover at about 47, 48%. But no, it was catastrophic. It was tectonic. The shifts was tectonic. It was an aardbeving, as they say, because the ANC ended up with 40%. Immediately, the 5 stages of grief kicked in. And as you know, the 5 stages of grief, the first one is always denial. Then there's anger. And eventually you get to the point of acceptance. And once it was accepted, as the majority of the votes were counted, it was concluded that the ANC was going to hover at 40%. Devastating. This immediately made us enter into a new era of politics, and that is coalitions. No party combined, all the parties combined, has more votes than the ANC. But because they are of such divergent policies and views, there's no way they are going to find agreement against the ANC. It's like saying that the DA, MK, and the EFF is going to sing from the same hymn sheet. The only time political parties do that is when it comes to party funding, because it is in all their interest to agree. So it was quite clear. And I think it's important to make this point, Lynette, that the ANC was not defeated by its opposition. It's very important. The ANC was not defeated by its opposition. So the DA cannot claim that they are the ones that made the ANC get less than 50%. The EFF can't make that claim.
It's literally, I remember the late Eusebius McKaiser saying the DA's response was unprovoked, cutting themselves unprovoked. That this demise that we've seen within the ANC is of their own doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You take the percentage of MK, the newcomer, and you add it to the 40%, and you will see the ANC was going to hover where it was predicted to be at about 47, 48%, and so on. So MK is the party that took a significant slice of the vote away from the ANC. And hence it is now the 3rd largest party on our political landscape, and the most fastest growing and significant party in the modern era. So the ANC then comes to a decision that it needs to enter into coalition politics. Now, fortunately, because we've had bad experiences with coalition politics in the metros, as well as in many municipalities, the ANC had the foresight of developing a policy document to guide them with how they are going to approach coalitions. One could argue that they had the foresight to know that that eventuality will dawn, it will come. And it is, among other things, one of the simple examples one can make, Lynette, is that they found that coalitions must not just be entered into because you want to hold on to power. If the coalition is not about advancing the interest of the people, the electorate, then there's no point. Secondly, they've also come to appreciate that just because you are a small party that is a kingmaker, it doesn't mean that you must now be the biggest receiver of the benefit. What we've seen, for example, in the city of Johannesburg, a party with less than 1% a party with less than 1%, is now the mayor of the biggest metro, the wealthiest metro in sub-Saharan Africa. It's just so the ANC has crafted new rules and guidelines to say this cannot happen, and hopefully that will hold them in good stead as they enter into these negotiations. Now, let's come to the scenarios. In my latest book, Is the Party Over?
Oh,
there are obviously a scenario that also talk to the eventuality of having to go into coalitions and so forth. The obvious one, Lynette, is what some would call the biggest sin, and that is an alliance between the governing party and the main opposition.
Yes.
The DA. There are forces within both parties that threatens to resign if such an alliance or such a coalition happens.
If you can recall, prior to the election, the DA and the ANC and MK and EFF had a list of non-negotiables. But now it seems that this election's results have forced them to have to sit across the table of your so-called enemy.
Yes, I've always not paid not much attention to these statements that were made prior to the elections, because we've seen time and time again, once the cards are dished out, once we know how the cards have fallen, then people change their priorities. I find it so interesting, for example, Annette, that there are still so many smaller parties that every time go into an alliance, a broad alliance with the DA, and the DA just drops them like a hot potato. Yeah. So the moonshot pack, it's just anyway. The point is that you are right. Many have made many demands and so forth. Others have now reviewed those demands. For example, the EFF is no longer insistent that they will only talk to the ANC unless Ramaphosa resigns. I think they've come to appreciate that that's a red line that the ANC is not prepared to entertain. Or at least we'll see post the NEC meeting in the next 2 days, because you never know what will happen in that meeting. They've recalled 2 former presidents before.
Yes.
So we hope that will not happen, but we never know. Anyway, so there is the grand coalition, what they talk of, the grand coalition between the ANC and the DA. Recently, I've been interacting with people from both sides, and ANC types are saying if they should be forced to go into such an alliance, they would want to involve a third smaller party, just to water it down and not to make it so obvious that it is the ANC and the DA. And so they might invite the IFP in. Just to give a bit of flavor and spice to the situation. The second scenario is a scenario where the ANC, obviously, there are many in the ANC currently arguing that, as you've eloquently outlined earlier, Lynette, that the MKP and the EFF are simply breakaways from the same ANC.
Yes.
They are actually ANC.
Yes.
And so as ANC, we should all three just come together as a family. We've had some family feuds. There's some personality.
Let's rebrand ourselves.
And so some out there are saying, can't the 3 families come together and kiss and make up and so on and so forth? The problem is that, oh no, wait, before I come to the consequences. So there's that second scenario. The ANC family must just come back together, kiss and make up, and they represent the overwhelming majority of the votes, more than 60%. And for a way, the transformation agenda is back on track. The third scenario is excluding MK. Excluding MK and only enter into an alliance or a coalition with the EFF. That unfortunately only gives you 49%. So you would have to bring a third partner in, perhaps a Patriotic Alliance, perhaps Rise Mzansi, one of the smaller parties that got more than 2%. And then you cobble a government together. Now, Let me talk about the last one and the problems with it. There is some other options, and I'll come back to that. The problem with the coalition with the EFF is that we have seen the track record of our coalitions with the EFF in municipalities and metros. Yes. They're unprincipled, they're sporadic, they're schizophrenic. When it suits them, they step outside of the coalition and put unusual and unreasonable demands on the table. If it's not met, they stay out. If it's met, they come back. Usually that is rent seeking. They want more money and more money and more money. You can ask Herman Mashaba how that went for him whilst he was trying to keep the city of Johannesburg together. And so that is an unreliable partner. Juju knows he needs this coalition just like the ANC. Just like the ANC. But he knows that it's going to take time for them to trust him. The problem with the MK-EFF, and here I want to come back to this issue of the renewal, because people want to dismiss it. I say again, Lynette, MK is a direct result because of the renewal project that is happening inside the ANC. The getting rid of bad apples, to get rid of those that are corrupt, to get rid of those that are not in keeping with the values and principles of the ANC as we know it. And that's why MK came about. Now, if you invite it back in, then you are going to remain with an untransformed ANC. Because you are just simply inviting the Ace Mahashules, the Gumedes, all of them back in. Zuma, etc., etc. Is that really what you want? Is that the price you are prepared to pay in order to have the numbers and pretend that you are now back as one unified family? And lastly, there is the alternative, which is that you form a government of national unity. The ANC and the DA says to themselves, we are going to expose ourselves too much to our membership and our supporters. And we might actually feel the consequence of that in the next upcoming elections. So to avoid that, let's rather go into a government of national unity, which is a multi-party solution, where you invite as many as you can in. It has been done before.
Yes.
Not with so many parties, but it has been done before. It's about how you put an agreement together and agree on some of the fundamentals. And some of the fundamentals would be things like, for example, Annette, this is a constitutional democracy and it's not going to change. We have a proportional representative system and it's not going to change. We have the independence of our three state arms of state, that being the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, and that is not going to change. And so on and so forth. Elements and principles of non-racialism, non-sexism, and democracy is not going to change. And this is important because when you listen to the MK, for example, among others, they challenge our constitutional democracy. They want to give more credence and authority to traditional authorities, royal houses like the Zulu King, etc., etc. They are already calling into question the judicial system because they feel it is directed only at their leader,
yes,
former President Zuma. Of course, from the EFF, they talk of wide-scale nationalization and land expropriation without compensation and so on and so forth. These things need to be tapered. It needs to be reasonable. And so there needs to be an agreement. And once we can sign off on that agreement, then we can have a government of national unity, because it means that there will be able to be a government that is stable and that is continuous. Finally, if you cannot agree on any of this, and let me give you two examples. If you cannot agree amongst yourselves as political parties because you are insistent on your demands and you are not prepared to taper them or to back down, if you are not prepared to sign an agreement for a government of national unity to take the country forward, if these things fail and we are outside of the 30 days allowance as per the Constitution. In other words, you must try and do these things within 1 month. If you fail to do this, the Constitution then empowers the president to announce a new date for a new elections within 6 months. No one wants this out.
Yes, I was about to say no one wants that.
May I also just caution, Lynette, as a final remark, those that think it might be advantageous for the ANC to have a re-election, they must be careful, because it might actually be completely negative and worse for the ANC. So don't for 1 minute think that this is a strategy on the part of the ANC to try and get out of this 40%. They could come off far worse, because everyone might just say, including the 6 million, that, you know what, to hell with it, I'm not going to go and vote. This is just a circus.